Good evening, everyone. I believe our episode tonight of Men Around the Führer is very special. So hear now the tale of a man whose words possessed the power to reshape reality, yet whose life was rooted in bitterness and failure. Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels, the architect of deceit. He was born on October 29, 1897 in Reich, Germany, within the Rhineland, into a family that, while Roman Catholic and strict, was of relatively modest social background. From the very beginning, fate seemed to have marked him. Goebbels was born with a physical defect, a deformed right leg, the painful result of osteomyelitis, and a subsequent unsuccessful operation. Though his parents afforded him a private all-boys Catholic high school and even paid for the operation, his left leg remained permanently shorter than his right. Consequently, he required a metal brace and a special shoe throughout his life, forever walking with a pronounced limp. His stature was slight, he stood only about 5 feet tall, and he was noticeably frail in a society and political movement that would later elevate physical perfection and condemn the disabled. Goebbels' physical form stood in stark contrast to the Aryan ideal. This reality, coupled with chronic illness, fostered a deep-seated anger. He felt the world was unfair and sought refuge in intellectual pursuits, focusing his energy on reading and achieving academic success. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant and sharp student. He studied literature, history, and philosophy at several German universities, including Bonn, Würzburg, Freiburg, and Heidelberg, eventually obtaining a doctorate in philosophy in 1920 or 1921. It was during this period that he completely rejected his Catholic upbringing. The Great War, which swept into the lives of his generation in August 1914, offered Goebbels no release or glory. His disability barred him from military service, a rejection he bitterly resented. This enduring frustration plagued him, as he was surrounded for the rest of his career by men who boasted the camaraderie and shared fellowship of war veterans. So great was his sense of exclusion that he sometimes falsely claimed his limp was the result of a war wound. His post-academic life was defined by disappointment. He worked various menial jobs, clerk, private tutor, and journalist. He harbored grand ambitions of becoming a celebrated author, penning a semi-autobiographical 3-part novel, Michael, A German Destiny, in diary form, published in 1929. But his literary efforts were largely rejected and failed to gain him renown. He was deeply embittered by his failure to build a literary career. Goebbels saw himself as a great thinker and philosopher, writing articles reflecting his nascent anti-Semitic views and contempt for modern culture. Yet very few cared to read his work. He was, by nearly all accounts, a failed writer and an incredibly damaged man. It was in this state of stagnation and depression, desperately seeking inspiration and someone to blame for his struggles, that Goebbels turned to the fledgling Nazi Party, NSDAP. He joined in late 1924, a time when Adolf Hitler was still in prison. Initially, Goebbels was aligned with the party's left wing, led by Gregor Strasser, and took the socialist agenda of the National Socialist German Workers' Party seriously. He was, perhaps ironically given his future trajectory, horrified by the extreme Bavarians, Hitler and his southern faction, who focused heavily on anti-Semitism and anti-ultranationalist policies. Goebbels clashed fiercely with Hitler's declaration that the Soviet Union must be destroyed and his characterization of socialism as a Jewish creation. The ideological schism peaked when Hitler asserted that private property would not be expropriated. Goebbels was outraged, writing that he no longer fully believed in Hitler. He felt devastated, realizing that in Hitler's mind the true enemy was always the Jew, never the capitalist. He dismissed Hitler as a mere reactionary. But the currents of political fervor soon changed this initial repulsion into fanatical devotion. In February 1926, Hitler, having completed his work on Mein Kampf, summoned about 60 regional leaders, including Goebbels, to a meeting in Bamberg. Hitler, a formidable political operator and orator par excellence, repudiated the socialist wing's program. In that moment, Goebbels fell completely under Hitler's spell. He realized that Hitler was the individual, the religious savior that Germany, and he himself, was yearning for. Hitler, recognizing Goebbels' verbal facility and intellect, cultivated the relationship, offering him total leadership if he would shed his socialist tendencies and accept Hitler's supreme guidance. Goebbels capitulated instantly, offering total loyalty, a pledge he maintained until the final, brutal end. Goebbels' enduring allegiance was distilled into his personal motto, "He who forsakes the Führer withers away." Goebbels was immediately brought into the fold and rewarded for his newfound, unwavering loyalty. In October 1926, Hitler appointed him Gauleiter, party chief, for Greater Berlin. Berlin was a difficult assignment, a known stronghold for socialists and communists. Goebbels was eager to prove his worth, determined to challenge the dominant parties of the left. As district leader, Goebbels displayed boundless organizational talent and a relentless work ethic. He established himself as a master of political agitation. He built the Nazi Party structure in Berlin from the ground up. His methods were brutal and effective for recruitment. He used his street fighters, the SA, stormtroopers, to march into working-class areas, deliberately provoking violent confrontations. When Nazis were injured or killed, Goebbels leveraged their deaths, invoking the heroism of these martyrs to garner public attention and boost recruitment. The image of the muscular stormtrooper or the bandaged Nazi martyr became standard propaganda visuals. The Horst Wessel song, named for a 23-year-old protégé who died in one such altercation, became the official anthem of the Nazi Party. Goebbels launched his own newspaper, Der Angriff, The Assault, in 1927. It preached anti-communism, anti-Semitism, and the necessity of a Hitler dictatorship. His propaganda techniques were totally cynical. He judged propaganda purely by its outcome. Propaganda is good, which leads to success, and that is bad, which fails to achieve the desired result. He knew he was exploiting the basest instincts of the German populace: racism, xenophobia, class envy, and insecurity. As an orator, Goebbels quickly rose to be second only to Hitler. Unlike Hitler's passionate horse delivery, Goebbels was cool, sarcastic, and a master of biting invective and insinuation. He retained a cynical detachment from his own rhetoric, claiming he could play the popular will like a piano and drive audiences into ecstasy not through genuine passion but through sober psychological calculation. Despite his rhetorical prowess, early electoral success in Berlin was elusive. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, the Nazis polled less than 2% of the vote in Berlin. However, Goebbels secured a seat in parliament which provided him with a salary and immunity from prosecution, crucial given his campaign of violence and agitation. Even at its peak in 1932, the Nazi Party's vote share in Berlin was only 28%. Resisting the national appeal more than any other major city. By 1930, Hitler was supremely impressed with Goebbels' mastery of modern propaganda techniques. Recognizing that the growing popularity of the party meant he could no longer dedicate his time solely to propaganda, Hitler was forced to delegate the function. In April 1930, Goebbels was appointed head of the Nazi Party's national propaganda apparatus, Reichspropagandaleiter, gaining control of the party's national newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, and other publications. Goebbels was a political genius in campaign management. He choreographed Hitler's dramatic 1932 presidential campaign, Hitler over Germany, pioneering the use of radio and cinema. He presented Hitler as an energetic figure, using modern air travel to campaign across the country. He utilized massive spectacle, including brass bands, masked choirs, and torchlight parades, successfully capturing the imagination of young voters. More fundamentally, Goebbels is credited with engineering the cult of personality around Hitler, The Führer myth. He orchestrated a pseudo-religious worship of Hitler as the savior of Germany, rescuing the nation from perceived threats like Jews and Marxists. He may have even introduced the famous greeting, Heil Hitler. When Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor on January 30, 1933, Goebbels initially received no cabinet post. Yet, as the party's propaganda chief, he acted as if he already held immense power, immediately commandeering state radio to broadcast the celebratory torchlight parade live. His reward came shortly after. On March 13, 1933, Joseph Goebbels was appointed Reich Minister for Propaganda and Public Enlightenment. At 35, he was the youngest minister in Hitler's cabinet, flanking Hitler and Goering in official photographs. The new ministry was established to dominate Germany not merely through terror, but by seizing the hearts and minds of the population through absolute control of German culture. Goebbels' explicit mandate was the political decontamination of public life, coordinating all culture, including education, theater, film, literature, the press, and broadcasting, with Nazi ideological goals. He wielded enormous influence, essential to the regime's survival. Goebbels implemented total control swiftly. He established the Reich Chamber of Culture in 1933, mandating that only members could work in cultural professions. This mechanism allowed him to systematically purge Jews, Marxists, socialists, and liberals, along with practitioners of degenerate art forms. Soon, every form of media, every book, play, film, and concert required supervision by the propaganda ministry. He saw the purpose of propaganda and art alike as achieving a spiritual mobilization of the German people. He utilized mass media with unprecedented efficiency. He promoted approved art and music and, understanding the power of radio, organized the mass production and sale of cheap people's receivers. He also installed a network of public loudspeakers to broadcast Hitler's speeches and other key propaganda events. His propaganda philosophy emphasized stealth. He observed that Soviet propaganda, being devoid of entertainment, was too transparent. Goebbels believed the message should be embedded in a framework of massive entertainment, perhaps 99% entertainment and 1% propaganda, to subtly enter the public mind. One of the most defining moments of his tenure occurred shortly after his appointment, the infamous public burning of books. On May 10, 1933, Goebbels supervised the burning of 20,000 volumes of so-called un-German books, written by Jewish, leftist, or pacifist authors in Berlin's Babelplatz. He spoke during the event proclaiming the cleaning of the German spirit. This act of purification by fire was highly theatrical, filmed for national consumption, and served as a ritual dedicated to Nazi ideology. Goebbels had a particular obsession with film, recognizing its immense power to incite emotion. He forcibly took over the UFA studio, the largest in Berlin. He personally oversaw the production of hundreds of propaganda films and newsreels. He believed visual images held greater credibility than spoken or written words. He used cinematic techniques, like staging events or blurring the line between fiction and reality, to manipulate audiences who were not used to mass media and perhaps not as sophisticated in separating truth from fiction. For example, the 1941 film I Accuse was specifically orchestrated to sway public opinion in favor of the Action T4 program, which sanctioned the euthanasia of disabled and terminally ill people. His control of the media was so effective that even international journalists were sometimes confused, relying on Radio Berlin for information due to its perceived accuracy, credibility, and professionalism, a testament to the deceptive sophistication of his propaganda machine. Goebbels' influence was rooted in his fanatic anti-Semitism. He needed a political cause to maintain his status, and he adopted extreme anti-Jewish ideology with calculating zeal, maintaining constant pressure on Jewish communities. He preached a message of national unity and Aryan racial purity bound while simultaneously proclaiming the necessity of persecuting Jews and others excluded from the Nazi national community. This campaign of hate reached a devastating climax in Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. On November the 9th, 1938, Goebbels was the chief instigator. He convinced Hitler that the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a Jew provided the perfect pretext for a nationwide pogrom. He publicly announced that demonstrations should not be prepared by the party, but if they erupted spontaneously, they are not to be hampered. This was widely understood as an explicit command to unleash violence. Rioters destroyed hundreds of synagogues, desecrated cemeteries, attacked 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses, killed at least 90 people, and dragged some 30,000 Jews off to concentration camps. Yet, even this political fanaticism was occasionally interrupted by private scandal. In 1937, Goebbels began an intense affair with Lida Barova, a Czech actress who was a genuine Nazi sympathizer. Goebbels' wife, Magda, appealed directly to Hitler, who was fond of her and their 6 young children. Hitler, an arch-conservative in sexual matters, ordered Goebbels to end the affair. Goebbels, captivated, begged for permission for a divorce, and even offered to resign his powerful post and move to Japan to be with Barova. Hitler refused, insisting Goebbels was far too valuable and forcing him to remain in his position. Barova was summarily deported to Czechoslovakia. This humiliation severely damaged Goebbels' standing in Hitler's inner circle, prompting him to redouble his anti-Semitic zeal as a means of restoring his reputation. It is worth noting the vast documentation Goebbels produced during these years. Between 1923 and 1945, he produced a staggering amount of documents, dictated notes, and collated materials, sometimes up to 100 typed pages per day, largely written by employees. These voluminous writings, often misleadingly termed his diaries, served a clear propaganda purpose: to justify the terror, crime, war, and inhumanity of the National Socialist regime. These texts were not simply spontaneous, confessional utterances, but a political compilation intended to bear witness to his perspective and actions, and likely written with an enhanced motivation for publication to a larger audience. When Germany unleashed World War II in September 1939, Hitler became wholly focused on military affairs, making fewer public appearances. Consequently, Goebbels increasingly became the public face and the voice of the Nazi regime for the German people. He was elevated to the inner circle alongside figures like Himmler, Goering, and Bormann, benefiting from his constant presence near Hitler, particularly at the Berghof. As the tide of war flowed, Goebbels steadily expanded his influence over domestic policy, concerning himself with civilian morale, including issues of wages, housing, and rationing. Goebbels was fanatical in driving the Nazi narrative that World War II was, in fact, the Jewish War, der Jüdische Krieg. He asserted that international Jewry was an existing conspiracy that had launched the conflict and was the true power behind the anti-Hitler coalition of London, Moscow, and Washington. He contended that the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies could only be explained as the work of the international Jewish conspiracy, pulling the strings of both sides. Crucially, Goebbels used this paranoid projection to justify the escalating violence. He argued that since Jewry intended to exterminate the German people, Germany's annihilation of the Jews was an act of justified retaliation and national self-defense. He publicly utilized the explicit, non-euphemistic German verbs vernichten and ausrotten, annihilate, exterminate, totally destroy, to declare Hitler's prophecy that the Jewish race in Europe would be destroyed if a world war began, was being fulfilled. He wrote in Das Reich that the historical guilt of world Jewry for the outbreak and expansion of this war has been so extensively demonstrated that there's no need to waste any more words on it. He was explicit. The government's policy was to finally be done with them. Goebbels used his influence to push for the practical implementation of the genocide. In September 1941, he personally pressed Hitler for the Jews of Berlin to be deported first. By March 1942, he was aware of the decisions made at the Wannsee Conference. He recorded in his diary that Jews were being deported to the east, describing the procedure as fairly barbaric, and noting that 60% would be liquidated while the rest would be worked to death. Despite knowing the fate of the victims, he continued to lobby for accelerated deportations, writing that it would be best to kill them altogether. As the tide of war turned decisively against Germany, symbolized by the crushing defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad in February 1943, Goebbels' propaganda machine shifted into overdrive. On February 18, 1943, Goebbels delivered what many consider his most famous and effective speech, the Total War Address at the Berlin Sportpalast. Speaking to a carefully selected and massive audience of 14,000 party officials, workers, veterans, and women, with millions more listening via radio, he offered an unvarnished picture of the situation concerning Germany's recent misfortunes and impending grim reality. Acknowledging the recent losses, including Stalingrad and setbacks in North Africa, and the Allied demand for unconditional surrender, Goebbels crafted a new myth of national strength. He assured the audience that the German people, disciplined by National Socialism, could face the full truth. His central argument was that Germany alone stood between Europe and the onslaught of Bolshevism. To counter this existential threat, Germany had to implement equivalent methods in a war more total than anything previously imagined. This demand justified severe austerity measures enacted by Hitler, including closing 100,000 restaurants and clubs and conscripting civilians for war work. He intentionally called for the closing of specific establishments, such as restaurants, to spite rivals like Hermann Göring, who enjoyed excessive pleasures during wartime. Goebbels led the audience through a dramatic series of 10 questions, whipping them into a frenzy of fanatic applause. The climax was his thunderous demand, "I ask you, do you want total war? If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything that we can even imagine today?" The resulting fanaticism stunned even high-ranking Nazis. Albert Speer noted he had never seen an audience so effectively roused. The moment temporarily reinvigorated the German war effort under the slogan, "Let the storm break loose." Goebbels' power peaked in the summer of 1944. Following the attempted assassination of Hitler in the July 20th plot, Goebbels, Himmler, and Speer formed the real center of government, rallying resistance to the plotters. Hitler appointed Goebbels Reich plenipotentiary for total war on July 23, 1944, tasking him with maximizing manpower for arms production and the military. Though he promised Hitler 1 million new soldiers, the combined military and economic power of the Allies and the Soviet Union had simply become too great. As 1945 began and the Soviets advanced on the Oder and the Western Allies prepared to cross the Rhine, Goebbels' speeches adopted an increasingly apocalyptic tone. He understood that defeat was inevitable. Goebbels proved to be the most devoted and loyal of Hitler's major subordinates. While Göring and Himmler were stripped of their ranks for treason or discredited, Goebbels argued fiercely against the idea of retreat or escape, pushing instead for a heroic last stand in the ruins of the Reich capital. He moved his family, his wife Magda and their 6 children, into the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Goebbels had rejected any thought of surrender, noting in his diary that they were too deeply enmeshed in the Jewish question for there to be any escape for us. On April 29, 1945, Goebbels was one of the 4 witnesses to Hitler's final political testament. Hitler committed suicide the next afternoon, April 30th. In his last act, Hitler named Joseph Goebbels as the new Reich Chancellor of Germany. Goebbels held this position for only one day, rejecting surrender or escape. He was deeply depressed by Hitler's death, commenting, "The heart of Germany has ceased to beat, the Führer is dead," and stating, "The only way left for us is the one which Hitler chose. I shall follow his example." On May 1st, 1945, Joseph and Magda Goebbels perpetrated the most horrifying and calculated crime of their lives. They arranged to poison their 6 children, with Magda assisting a dentist in sedating them before administering the poison. They could not imagine their children living in a world without National Socialism or Adolf Hitler as its savior. After the children were dead, Joseph and Magda Goebbels committed suicide. German soldiers tried to burn their bodies in the courtyard to prevent them from becoming trophies for the advancing Soviets. Joseph Goebbels, the propagandist, brainwashed millions of Germans to pave the way for the Holocaust and the Second World War, utilizing every available medium to create a manufactured reality of absolute power and imminent racial danger. His ultimate crime, the murder of his own 6 children, demonstrated a level of total evil commitment to the Nazi cause, making him a true believer to the very end. Nazi control over public information ended abruptly with his suicide and the collapse of the regime in May 1945. The legacy of Joseph Goebbels is inextricably linked not just to his actions but to the structure and principles he imposed on mass communication. He operated on a set of cynical psychological calculations that formed the backbone of the Reich's messaging. Goebbels operated under the foundational belief that propaganda was an arm of warfare, not merely a tool for conveying information. 1. Centralized authority. Goebbels passionately believed that all propaganda, news and cultural matters must be subordinate to a single authority, himself the Minister of Propaganda. This unified command was intended to ensure efficiency and consistency in messaging. He issued all directives detailing how specific campaigns should be augmented, diminished, or ignored entirely. However, even in a totalitarian regime, he failed to achieve absolute unification, battling constantly with rival Nazi leaders like Ribbentrop, Rosenberg, and Goering over control of messaging. 2. Intelligence is paramount. Goebbels relied heavily on intelligence to tailor his message to the audience and the event. He used reports from the secret police, SD, his own propaganda offices, and foreign monitoring of enemy media. Yet he often preferred his own intuition and common sense over formal reports, believing his mother, for instance, knew the people's sentiments better than experts who judge from the ivory tower of scientific inquiry. 3. Action must serve propaganda. Crucially, Goebbels argued that the propaganda consequences of any policy must be considered during the planning phase. It was more valuable to help plan an event, like a trial or an air warfare campaign, than merely to rationalize one after the fact. 4. Affecting the enemy. Propaganda was designed to influence the enemy's policies and actions. This included disseminating material that caused the enemy to draw desired conclusions, e.g., exaggerating German resistance to dissuade invasion, or suppressing desirable information that might aid enemy intelligence. Conversely, he adopted a kiss of death strategy, maintaining silence on quarrels among the Allies, believing that controversy between the Allies is a small plant which thrives best when it is left to its own natural growth. 5. Credibility over truth. Goebbels' position on truth was purely pragmatic. He claimed to tell the truth, but in reality, credibility was the sole determining factor. Truth was used when possible, lest the facts or the enemy expose a falsehood. He recognized that Germans had grown sophisticated and could read between the lines. Lies were only useful when they were impossible to disprove. He was afraid to announce that General Rommel had left Africa because, with the campaign nearing catastrophe, nobody will believe us. 6. Managing enemy propaganda. He was profoundly fearful of enemy broadcasts, knowing that foreign radio was widely listened to despite the risk of death. He constantly analyzed enemy messaging. When deciding whether to ignore or refute an enemy claim, he balanced several factors. Was the enemy attempting to goad him into revealing information? Was the claim too blatant to be left unanswered? Was his own counter-argument strong enough to stand up to scrutiny? Or would silence be better? He would employ a counterclaim, such as attacking English cruelty in India, instead of replying directly to criticism of German anti-Jewish measures, if it served his objectives. 7. Timing and repetition. Agility was essential. Goebbels believed, "Whoever speaks the first word to the world is always right." Themes had to be repeated until they were thoroughly learned and reinforced, sometimes dedicating 70 to 80% of broadcasts to a single campaign, like anti-Semitism. However, repetition could not cross the point of diminishing effectiveness, becoming boring or unimpressive. 8. Labeling and slogans. Goebbels placed great stress on distinctive phrases and slogans like "creeping crisis" to describe unrest in England. These labels had to be simple, painting in black and white, and easily learned, appealing to the masses rather than the intellectuals. Once learned, they were repeated constantly in appropriate situations to efficiently transfer emotional reactions to new events. 9. Anxiety management, strength through fear. Propaganda aimed to achieve an optimum anxiety level, avoiding panic while eliminating complacency. The primary technique was strength through fear, reinforcing anxiety regarding the consequences of defeat. Enemy war aims, particularly the threat of Bolshevism and demands for reparations, were featured prominently to convince Germans that the war was a fight for their very lives. Conversely, Goebbels sought to diminish anxiety that was too high, such as that caused by heavy air raids or by military setbacks. 10. Displacement of aggression. During periods of adversity, Goebbels sought to divert German frustration by providing clear targets for hatred. Favorite hate objects were Jews and Bolsheviks, constantly combining anti-Semitic campaigns with active measures against Jews. For external propaganda, he focused on wedge driving, fomenting distrust and suspicion among Germany's enemies. 11. Recognizing impotency. Goebbels was aware of propaganda's limitations. He noted that propaganda could not immediately affect fundamental drives like sex or hunger. It could not alter the religious impulses of many Germans or significantly increase industrial production. When facing undeniable facts like military defeats or heavy air raids, propaganda became insufficient, and he lamented that only a big victory somewhere could truly restore morale. The vast body of documents Goebbels left behind, the Goebbels diaries, remains one of the most important sources for evaluating National Socialist propaganda and the inner workings of the regime. Yet, the very nature and publication of these documents have themselves become a subject of considerable historical controversy. Between 1923 and 1945, Goebbels produced his voluminous notes, often dictating material compiled by his employees, which could result in a single daily entry comprising up to 100 typed pages. The quality varied, and the scale was such that the compilation is better categorized as a political journal intended to justify the regime's terror and crimes rather than a traditional diary. The Institute of Contemporary History, IFC, in Munich, undertook the challenging task of publishing these notes in scholarly editions, first in 1987, 4 volumes, and then a revised edition between 1993 and 2008, 29 volumes. However, critics argue that neither edition met the basic standards of scholarly editing. Key issues raised by historians include lack of context. The editions failed to include essays providing background on the Nazi dictatorship, the propagandistic intent behind the documents, or explanatory annotations regarding historical context. Fictional narrative. The editors incorrectly declared the documents to be a diary and collated them chronologically, despite the texts originating at different times and in different notebooks. The term compilation would have been more appropriate. Misinterpretation of motives. Critics charge that the introduction fundamentally misunderstood Goebbels' motifs, absurdly describing his notes as confessional utterances and suggesting that writing had an autogenic training effect or allowed him to grant himself absolution. This gave readers a fundamentally misleading impression of Goebbels' attitude, ignoring the text's primary function as propaganda. The Genoud connection. Troubling questions arose concerning the involvement of Swiss Nazi sympathizer François Genoud, who claimed exclusive rights to publish Goebbels' material. Genoud, who admired Goebbels as a genius and hero, wished for the texts to be published in their entirety and preferably without annotations. Critics suspect that the decision by the editors to publish redundant propagandistic texts in full and later to drop plans for an additional volume of detailed commentary due to financial reasons may have been part of an arrangement with Genoud. The controversy highlights a central difficulty for historians: how to deal with a mass of material intentionally created by the regime's master propagandist to shape perception, even posthumously. Joseph Goebbels, the maestro of deceit, thus ensured that even his personal record remained a contested battleground long after his physical body had ceased to exist. Joseph Goebbels' importance to Hitler was immense, both politically and personally. He was instrumental in Hitler's rise and control, paving the way for the Nazi ideology to dominate Germany through the media. He was Hitler's chosen best man at his wedding and a godfather to his children. Yet politically, he was often relegated to an outer circle during the high point of the regime, excluded from major decisions on foreign affairs. It was only after 1943, as the Reich began to decline, that Goebbels regained a major role, acting as the critical messenger to spur the nation toward total war. On a personal level, however, his loyalty was absolute and fanatic. While others faltered, Goering and Himmler proving traitorous in the final days, Goebbels alone remained loyal until the bitter end, joining his Führer in the bunker. His final horrifying decision to destroy his children and himself rather than live without the Nazi faith stands as the ultimate testament to his devotion. It was a perverse, absolute commitment that proved him to be one of the most dangerous followers Hitler ever commanded. The political power of Goebbels ended on May 1, 1945, but the psychological effects of his relentless propaganda, the pervasive fear, the ingrained hatred, the paranoid myth of the Jewish war, took decades to unravel from the German consciousness. He had successfully brainwashed a nation. And so ends the story of the doctor who could have been a writer, the invalid who longed for a hero's status, and the master of rhetoric who orchestrated the unmaking of a nation loyal to his evil vision until the very last moment of his self-inflicted doom.